Welcome to our summer video series on the Ten Commandments. We're almost done. We have 2 more to go. Today we're going to focus on the 8th commandment, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. If this is your first time checking out this video, I'm Pastor Eric, and this is Pastor Bree. We are pastors at Mountain View Lutheran Church in Edgewood, Washington. Glad that you've joined us, and check out our earlier videos where we have discussed, the earlier commandments. And really what we're trying to do is we're trying to kind of expand, what these commandments mean. We're trying to put them in the historical context of the Exodus and Moses freeing God's people from Egypt and from the Egyptian Pharaoh, because God's heart broke because of the oppression and the suffering of his people, and wanted his people to be free. That's really what it means to be God's people. It means to live free, and part of what that freedom looks like, it means that we have a healthy relationship with God, and we have a healthy relationship with each other. That is the container, or the environment, so to speak, that allows us to actually enjoy and share and fully live in this gift of freedom. And so with this commandment, you shall not bear false witness. I think we need to kind of just begin with maybe the default the way we understand this is, don't tell a lie.
Yeah, we've narrowed it in our kind of common understanding.
Yeah, but that's great for teaching children. Mm-hmm. I think that's probably
a good start.
The best way to teach children, don't lie, tell the truth. That's certainly the way I taught my children, at the bedtime routine, and we'd go through the 10 Commandments, and my son would say, "Dad, what's bear false witness?" And I would just boil it down to, don't tell a lie, and for a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old, that's great. But, Martin Luther, in his explanation on the Large Catechism, he really kind of goes into much broader implication in our life together, and so really this really comes down to, how do we preserve the good name and the honor of our neighbor? Our neighbor has property. Our neighbor, we're in relationship. And so a lot of the previous commandments kind of guard and set healthy boundaries, which are really about freedom. Mm-hmm. But this one is really more about something that's a little bit more abstract. It's just this idea of we have a reputation. We have a name. We have an identity. We have a humanity. And we want to, actively protect, and we want to promote that in our neighbor, and not in some false, accusational kind of way, or making the worst assumptions about each other. I think is a way that we can kind of, tarnish the reputation or tarnish the name of our neighbor. So, yeah.
I think it's really insightful on Luther's part too that, he acknowledges how important our reputation is, that's just as valuable as any property we might have, that it has impact on our relationships. And so this ties into that, and as Luther often talks about, we are, as Christians, we're called to help preserve and protect our neighbors in that sense. And so part of that's their reputation.
Yeah.
And it's also really interesting to think about, as Christians, we're called to be witnesses. We're called to be witnesses for Christ. We're called to be witnesses of God's good news. And this commandment is ultimately about bearing witness. How do we do that?
And is it a true witness or a false witness?
Yeah. And it's even more, true and false, even a little bit more complex than that in recognizing that, we're called to stand with people, and sometimes a false witness or a true witness, something might be true, but it might also be really hurtful. So this is kind of that speaking truth in love, sort of commandment that, as we talk about, it's not just don't tell a lie, but as we grow into maturity, we realize that truth and falsehood are more complex than that, right? And so how do we lovingly embody truth in our lives, even sometimes hard truth? That's not going to unnecessarily tarnish our neighbors. Obviously sometimes there are truths we need to speak that are very hard, but how do we do that with love and grace for one another at least?
And as, Bible believing Christians, if we believe that, we are all made in the image of God, it means that is part of our witness. I mean, we want to witness the image of God in our neighbor. And when we forget to do that, or maybe we fail to do that, or maybe we intentionally don't want to do that, for a neighbor, especially maybe someone we don't like very much, to then make kind of that knee-jerk negative assumption about what their motives might be up to, or some way that they've harmed me, but it's a false witness, it's a false accusation. That's very damaging, and I think we need the 8th commandment today more than ever. I mean, if I had to rank, of the 10, I mean, the first commandment is pretty hard to beat. I mean, that's kind of a universal one that we're always kind of violating, because we're always making other things into God. But I would say that the 8th commandment is a pretty strong second. Today, I mean, uniquely at our space, it seems like there's false witness just being, I mean, we are making claims about people that we've never even met before. We've never had a conversation with anyone, and yet we feel very strong negative assumptions about, and that seems pretty clear. It's a violation of this commandment. It's bearing false witness.
Yeah, and one of the challenges we have is that it's not only on an individual basis, but, we have systems that promote that false witness, whether it's in media or in our politics, the mudslinging that happens, where it's just kind of a given that what you're supposed to do is just go after your opponent and attack them to smear their image, I mean, that is what we are called not to be about as Christians. And so it's really hard when we have whole systems of being that support the negative of this commandment.
And I think one of the ways that happens is when we boil down the complex identity of a human being down to only one thing, which is not true. I mean, as human beings, we have so many complex identities. But let's just say for politics, for example, if I boil down your identity to you're a Democrat or you're a Republican, that's a false witness. No one is only that singular identity. Right. But that happens so often. And if I find out that you're the wrong political party, all of a sudden I've just put you, and I've ascribed all kinds of negative motives to you now. And how damaging is that to relationships? How damaging is that to community? Do we feel free when we do that? No, we feel less free. And so that's what this commandment is really trying to accomplish. It's trying to build up and help everyone to feel more freedom together.
Yeah, that reminds me of, perhaps some of you remember this. I think it was Thanksgiving Eve last year. One of our members, Brooke, talked about, she gave one of the homilies for Thanksgiving Eve service and talked about how in the public schools where she works, they talk about no one is a single story. And so we cannot boil someone down to any one aspect of their lives. And so she talked about, I'm more than a mom, and I'm more than a teacher, that there's many stories that make up the heart of who I am. And we have to hold those in complexity. But I think that's a great example of the positive of this commandment is, honoring people and their complexity and bearing witness to that rather than to just a single defining element.
And I mean, because this is what God does for us. I mean, God doesn't boil us down to the worst moment of our life. Right. No, God. I mean, I think God is. Essentially, God sees us as one of his beloved children. And yes, our sins are kind of a part of all this, but God sees something else and something better in us. That's actually more true than the sin and brokenness in our life. And I think what God hopes we see, is that there is this, divine image in us and in our neighbor as well. And sometimes we need to be the eyes to see something in another that they can't see in themselves. I think we need to talk about social media and how this, or just advertising or media. Just that whole, which is a big part of our, American life currently, false witness or false images of others or ourselves.
Yeah. And on social media, I think one of the challenges is it's so easy when we're not having a face-to-face conversation, when we're online to say something about someone that we're not standing and talking with in person, or to get into an argument and get so focused in that we fail to see that person that we're talking with and about. That's one of the challenges. There are many.
I think one of the challenges is, sometimes the false witness we make about our neighbor might not always be, of a negative, but if we see on social media, everyone's smiling, everyone looks so perfect, that in a sense can be kind of a false witness, because it's not true that anybody's life is perfect, but we might think, their life is so perfect, but mine isn't. It almost like it bounces back
Absolutely.
At us, and now we all of a sudden have kind of a false witness about ourselves and a false witness about our own goodness.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of spiraling out of control with social media.
I think we're going to end up touching on this again when we talk about the 8th and 9th commandments, which is on coveting. And that ties in as well. I think those, in that sense, these commandments are linked together, about how do we bear witness and what does that stir within us, and sometimes that's a coveting.
Right. Mm-hmm. Well, I like the image of being a witness, as a Christian. When we're a witness, it just means that we witness what reality is. We just witness something that, is true. But then the distortion of that becomes we can be a false witness if we change what we've actually witnessed. We can be a false witness if we say we've witnessed something that we really haven't witnessed. Or maybe in a sense, if we're quiet, if we've witnessed, something good about another person, but we kind of remain quiet about it, maybe because we're scared. Or maybe if we witness something good about another person, but we remain quiet about it, we fail to be a witness. Maybe that's also a form of being a false witness against our neighbor. Because we're not sticking up for them in a way that we have an opportunity to.
Right. I see in that, and in this commandment, that one of our positive practices, how we can live into the positive of this commandment to bear Christian witness in the world, right? For God and for our neighbors, is to be curious about people's stories, to hear and receive people's stories and their complexity, right? To not narrow one another, to not see only the bad or only the good and lift up, but to hold people in their complexity, and that includes ourselves too. Yeah, right?
That's hopeful. Being more curious, I like that. What have we? Well, I think we've been talking a lot about kind of the individual focus, but I think, kind of just the larger kind of community life that we participate in. I think discrimination and racism is it is a way that we experience a bearing of false witness, but kind of on that bigger community level. It's like one group of people is bearing false witness against another group of people because it's kind of detached from any kind of evidence. It's just all kind of knee-jerk assumptions and how damaging that can be. And so this commandment is really trying to warn us against that kind of tearing down behavior, so that, I mean, we live in a very diverse, pluralistic world, and that kind of bearing false witness against each other.
Right.
I mean, we are suffering the consequences of that right now.
Absolutely. Well, and racism, I mean, it makes assumptions about a group of people and their character, their value, right? And so that's a false witness. It fails to recognize and uphold the imago Dei within, an entire group of people.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it just narrows down a human being to this color of their skin, or it narrows down a human being to the language that they speak, or even it narrows down a human being to the religion that they might practice. So.
Yes. And we can recognize that some of those, some of that false witness then has even been passed down, certain attitudes that we carry. And that's where we really have to be, curious and examining the perspectives we hold about others is to say, well, how true is that to who they are and to the complexity of their lives and to how God calls us to be in relationship.
So the positive version of this commandment, you shall not, but you shall. You've already mentioned curiosity. I mean, I think that that's a helpful way to help us live out this commandment in a very positive way.
You shall be curious. You shall speak the truth in love.
And I think the power of story, just get to know another person's story. The power of story is really kind of an immune system against this kind of false witness. Just sit down and listen. Sit down and listen to your neighbor. Don't make assumptions. Get to know your neighbor instead. We have such a two-dimensional perspective on our neighbor, but the power of story is it gives us that third dimension. It gives us that depth into who they are. And false witness generally only happens in a two-dimensional world. But once someone becomes three-dimensional, it really becomes very hard to, bear false witness. I mean, because you do appreciate the depth and the complexity and the beauty of them as a human being created in the image of God.
Right.
So curiosity, story. Can we think of any other ways to positively carry out this?
Yeah, and one of the things Luther says is, don't be a judge when it's not your place to be a judge either. So I think that's being careful about how we give voice to, how we hold in our minds judgments about people. Instead hold the complexity that we're all saint and sinner. We're all,
Curiosity, stories, don't judge.
Yeah.
That's a nice round 3.
3. All right. Well, we want to thank you for joining us on this video. And we are always curious to hear your thoughts and your reflections about what's meaningful to you from this series. And we'll be back next week with one last video that covers the 8th and 9th, the 9th and 10th commandments on coveting relationships and property and things like that. So we hope you'll tune in for that last video of this series. Thanks.